On a winter night in Chicago, sometime in the middle of the 1920s, there might have been nothing especially remarkable about the little flower shop on the corner. Its window would have been dressed with pale roses, dark leaves, and ribbons curling in the cold. A single lamp might have glowed behind the glass. The pavement outside would have looked ordinary enough, with passing shoes, drifting cigarette smoke, and the muted rumble of the elevated train somewhere in the distance. If you had walked by too quickly, you might have remembered only the flowers, or perhaps the quiet woman near the counter trimming stems beneath a hanging light. You would not have guessed that below the polished floorboards, beneath the scent of lilies and damp paper, another world was waiting in the half-dark. And yet there it was, hidden in the city's lower breath. Behind a plain door and down a narrow wooden stair, the air changed. It grew warmer first, then softer, then faintly clouded with tobacco and perfume. Music rose slowly from below, not loud enough to startle, but steady enough to draw a tired mind forward. The city above remained what it was, lawful on paper, hurried in practice, full of carts and offices and invoices and aching feet. But below, for a few borrowed hours, time seemed to move to another rhythm. Not better exactly, not kinder, just slower, dimmer, and more forgiving to anyone who had grown tired of being only themselves. That was part of the magic of hidden places in Prohibition Chicago. The law had attempted to close one door, and in doing so it had invited 1,000 smaller doors to appear in its place. A city that was meant to become more upright and more restrained instead learned how to whisper. It learned passwords. It learned side entrances. It learned how to smile politely in daylight, and then vanish into cellars by evening. Chicago did not stop drinking because drinking had become illegal. It simply rearranged the act into something secretive, theatrical, and strangely intimate. A drink was no longer just a drink. It was proof that one knew where to go. It was proof that one belonged somewhere that many others could not find. For people worn down by modern life, that mattered more than legislators ever understood. It is easy from a distance to imagine the 1920s as nothing but brass, speed, and glittering confidence. But beneath that bright poster image was another texture entirely. Long clerical hours, factory fatigue, the loneliness of boarding houses, the narrowness of expectations, the quiet dread of returning each day to a life that felt already arranged. Chicago was large, exciting, and modern, but it could also be impersonal in a way that pressed upon the nerves. A city can make you feel surrounded and still leave you unaccompanied. It can feed ambition while quietly draining tenderness. For many people, the hidden room below the flower shop did not promise vice so much as relief. If you worked all day in a dry office, copying figures that were not yours, or in a shop where the windows glittered for customers richer than you, or in some narrow department where every bell and whistle belonged to someone else's schedule, then even the idea of a secret staircase might begin to glow in the mind. It suggested that the city had not told you everything. It suggested that behind all the respectable facades, something warmer was breathing. A room with low light and polished glasses did not merely offer amusement. It offered revision. You could come in with the same face and the same shoes and the same small worries, and yet feel, after a single hour, that you had stepped sideways out of your assigned life. That is why the first approach mattered so much. The flower shop was not only concealment, it was ceremony. You came in from the street where everyone was simply everyone, and the woman at the counter gave you a look that seemed to ask whether you belonged. The answer might depend on a password, or on the confidence with which you delivered it, or on whether someone had brought you. Then a hand, a nod, a private door, and the sensation of being admitted. A narrow stare can alter a mood more effectively than many speeches. With each step downward, the world above becomes less immediate. The noise of traffic dims. The mind loosens by the time the music reaches the ear fully. A person may already feel that some older weight has been left behind with the coats upstairs. Inside, the room might have looked almost tender. Lamps under amber shades, small round tables gathering shadow near their legs, bottles catching the light like dark jewels behind the bar. A pianist in shirt sleeves touching the keys with a mixture of precision and fatigue. Couples leaning toward one another as if private understanding were easy here. Men in hats tipped back slightly, women with beads resting along the line of the shoulder. Waiters threading carefully through the smoke. The remarkable thing was not that the room was loud or wild. In memory, it was often neither. Its deeper seduction lay in how complete it felt. A hidden place has a way of seeming self-contained, and people who enter it often begin, almost at once, to believe that the ordinary rules of proportion no longer apply. The drinks helped, of course, though not only because they contained alcohol. They arrived in slim glasses and carried names that sounded playful or imported or clever enough to flatter the person ordering them. Honey softened harsh spirits, citrus brightened industrial burn, sugar made bootleg liquor feel more refined than it was. A person did not have to know much about distillation to feel that this was sophisticated, or to hope that sophistication itself might be contagious. Even before intoxication settled in, there was the smaller intoxication of handling a beautiful glass in a room that seemed to approve of your presence. That approval could be almost medicinal to those who rarely received it elsewhere. In the daytime world, many young women were typists, clerks, seamstresses, stenographers, daughters whose wages flowed partly back toward parents still balancing old bills. Many young men were junior bookkeepers, sales assistants, runners, assistants to assistants, men whose suits were respectable enough, but whose names never made decisions. In such lives, dignity was often private and unspectacular. The hidden room below the flower shop reversed that balance. Here, if only for an evening, you might be noticed before you were needed. You might be spoken to before you were assigned. You might be admired for your wit, or your dress, or your calm manner of holding a glass instead of being measured only by output, obedience, and punctuality. Somewhere in that Chicago, on one of those tired evenings when the cold made every errand feel longer, a young woman named Margaret Sullivan finished a day at an insurance office downtown. She had been sorting forms, typing letters, carrying the dull burden of correctness from one desk to another. Her fingers ached by late afternoon. Her back had acquired the small, familiar stiffness that comes from leaning toward paper for too many hours. By the time she stepped outside, the winter sky had already darkened into a heavy blue-gray, and the city seemed to be hurrying past her rather than with her. She might have gone home, as she usually did, to a modest room and a simple meal and the kind of evening that disappears from memory while it is still happening. But that night, a friend persuaded her otherwise. The friend was one of those city women who seemed to absorb the new century a little faster than everyone else. She knew places. She knew who had been seen where. She knew which band was worth listening to, and which basement room had the softest chairs, or the most expensive men, or the best cocktails hidden under the worst names. She took Margaret by the arm with the easy certainty of someone who had already decided the evening's shape. There was a place, she said, that Margaret simply had to see. Nothing too rough, nothing low, a proper place, music, real people. A room worth staying awake for. Margaret hesitated, not because she lacked curiosity, but because the life she knew had trained hesitation into her. She had a mother who worried. She had habits that had kept her safe. She had heard, as everyone had, about raids and bad liquor and foolish girls who mistook excitement for good sense. Yet what she felt most strongly, standing there with her gloves still on and the office day still clinging to her shoulders, was not fear. It was fatigue, and fatigue, when it has lasted long enough, can make novelty feel almost responsible. A different evening begins to sound less like risk and more like mercy. So she agreed. They walked north through the cold, their breath visible, the street lamps laying down pale circles on the sidewalk. At the flower shop door, Margaret might have expected something disreputable or chaotic. Instead, she found restraint, a bell, flowers, a woman at the counter whose face gave nothing away. Then a glance, a phrase spoken softly, a private door opened just enough, and the beginning of the descent. It is difficult to know what any single person feels in the exact second before discovering a room that will later trouble their memory for years. But perhaps it was something like this. First, uncertainty, then interest, then the little inward lift that comes when one realizes the thing promised was real, after all. The music reached her halfway down the stairs by the bottom step. The warmth had touched her cheeks. By the time she entered the room itself, she had the unmistakable sensation of arriving somewhere that seemed already prepared to receive her. There was nothing extraordinary about Margaret from the outside. That was part of what made the room's attention so potent. She was 24, she worked hard, she sent money home when she could, she had done what good daughters and careful young women were expected to do. But in the Blue Moon, as the place was called, she was not reduced to those practical descriptions. She was a fresh face brought into a room that specialized in making ordinary people feel on the edge of transformation. The first drink was set before her almost like a gesture of welcome. It was pale gold and smelled of citrus and sweetness rather than raw spirit. She sipped cautiously, expecting harshness, and instead felt warmth move through her chest with a smoothness that seemed almost elegant. Around her, the room continued its quiet work, a laugh at the bar, a song drifting into another, someone asking where she worked, then listening as if the answer mattered. It is not that the drink changed the world in a miraculous instant. Rather, it lowered the hard outline the world had acquired. The office no longer seemed immediate. Her obligations no longer sat so heavily on the tongue. The city itself, which had so often felt like a machine of schedules and rent, became instead a background shimmer behind the present warmth of lamplight and music. That was the real first seduction. Not danger, not rebellion, relief. Many disasters begin with a crude temptation, but this was not crude at all. It was refined in exactly the way that made refusal difficult. Margaret did not step into the Blue Moon because she wanted to ruin herself. She stepped into it because she wanted, for one evening, to feel less tired of being good in ways no one noticed. When she laughed there, the laugh sounded easier. When she spoke, men and women leaned in rather than past her. When she listened to the piano, she had the strange sensation that some door inside her own mind had also opened, and that beyond it were better versions of conversation, better versions of evening, perhaps even better versions of herself. For a while, that was all it meant. She went home late, cheeks warmed by liquor and night air, carrying with her the glow of an evening different enough to remain vivid. The next day, she remembered the room the way one remembers a candle in winter, not only for its light, but for the shape it gave to the darkness around it. She told herself it had simply been a pleasant adventure, a small indulgence, one of those stories young people collect before they settle more firmly into routine. Yet the mind, once introduced to a hidden refuge, has a way of walking there ahead of the body. During the following week, as she typed and filed and corrected tiny errors in large stacks of paperwork, the room returned to her in fragments. The music, the amber light, the ease with which she had spoken, the sense of not being anonymous. She did not think of herself as craving a drink. She thought instead of craving the room, and there is a difference that matters. A drink can be measured. A room can colonize imagination. By Friday she went again, then perhaps not the next night. But soon enough, another friend joined them 1 week. Another table of familiar faces appeared the next. There was a pianist who nodded to regulars, a bartender who remembered what she liked, a bootlegger's assistant with polished shoes and easy stories. A woman in a beaded dress who treated Margaret as though the two of them belonged to some newer, freer species of city life. The room performed continuity with great skill. It made return feel natural. It made absence feel like missing out on one's actual life. Here's the subtle part of such transformations. People often imagine decline as a dramatic curve visible to everyone. But for Margaret, and for many like her, it would have looked at first like nothing more than a change in preference. Friday evenings began to matter more than Sundays. A little more money went toward nights out, a little less toward future planning. A headache after work became a reason to go rather than to stay in, because the room below the flower shop felt so much gentler than the room she rented. The city above was still full of responsibility. The city below, at least in appearance, asked only that she arrive. If she had been asked at this stage whether she was in danger, she would likely have smiled. Danger belonged to rougher establishments, rougher people, rougher habits. The blue moon did not seem rough. It seemed exquisite. That distinction mattered because it allowed her to mistake atmosphere for safety. A room can be expensive and still predatory. A man can be courteous and still calculating. A drink can taste delicate and still be ruinously strong. But refinement often disguises appetite more successfully than vulgarity ever could. As weeks passed into months, Margaret's ordinary life began to dim not through catastrophe, but through comparison. The office felt flatter because the blue moon existed. Meals eaten alone felt grayer because she could remember glasses flashing in low light and conversations that seemed full of possibility. Visits to family became easier to postpone because those rooms required explanation and dutifulness, while the hidden room required only arrival. Even her own small apartment, which had once represented independence, began to feel like a place where she merely waited until the more vivid part of the day could begin. It would be inaccurate to say that every night there was perfect. That is not how attachment works. Many nights were likely unremarkable in themselves. The band was fine. The drinks were expensive. The smoke was too thick. Someone talked too long about politics or shipments or somebody else's husband. And yet habit does not depend on constant ecstasy. It depends on rhythm. The blue moon became part of Margaret's internal clock. She looked toward it from the office before she was ready to admit that she was looking. She measured work by its distance from the first drink. She measured her mood by whether she expected to go that evening or not. What made this especially potent was that the room below the flower shop did not merely offer sensation. It offered belonging, arranged a style. A person at the blue moon could believe they had entered not only a place, but a category. Category was made up of those who knew, those who were not duped by ordinary respectability, those who understood how the city really moved after dark. Such categories flatter a tired mind. They make a person feel less like a worker and more like an initiate. It is easier to spend money you do not have when the spending seems to purchase identity. The management of places like the Blue Moon understood this better than many of their patrons understood themselves. The changing passwords did not exist only for security. They existed because secret entry is one of the cheapest and most effective methods of manufacturing intimacy. A man who knows your name is pleasant. A room that makes you prove yourself before entering feels profound. Every layer of ritual deepened the illusion that you were not simply consuming, but participating. The flower shop, the private glance, the stairs, the low lamps, the remembered preference at the bar, the pianist seeming to notice your applause, the same small constellation of faces appearing again and again. Together they formed a structure that made return feel less like spending and more like recognition. Meanwhile, the drinks themselves were changing Margaret in ways she could not easily name. They were stronger than they tasted. That was one danger. The other lay in their timing. Early in the evening, a person might still count. By midnight, a person feels, and when a room is designed so that one feeling leads smoothly into the next, counting begins to seem vulgar, even slightly disloyal to the atmosphere. Honey can hide a harsh spirit. Music can hide fatigue. Company can hide the first small signs of dependency. What cannot be hidden forever is the rearrangement taking place inside a life. Margaret started arriving earlier some nights. She stayed later on others. Her wages, modest to begin with, became less stable in practice because nights out had grown more frequent and more expensive. It is expensive to purchase escape, especially when the product being sold to you is not merely liquor, but the conviction that you are more alive in its presence. She bought better dresses than she had once thought sensible, because the room seemed to ask for them. She missed a Sunday visit home here and there. She called in sick once with a headache that was not exactly illness and not exactly fatigue. Such choices, scattered and mild in isolation, began to collect around the center of her weeks. There was also the private change in how she experienced sobriety. This did not yet feel like dependence, because she still imagined dependence as a crude thing belonging to men collapsed over bars. What she felt instead was a strange dullness away from the blue moon. Morning carried a thin ache. Afternoon held a vague impatience. The city seemed louder than before. Her own thoughts seemed drier. She did not tell herself that a drink would solve this. She told herself that evening would, that the hidden room would, that the small descent beneath the flower shop would smooth the rough grain the day had left in her nerves. And so the descent repeated. That is one of the oldest mechanisms in human life. We descend not always because the place below is perfect, but because repetition itself becomes reassuring. To go down the same stairs is to feel, however falsely, that one knows where one is going. Modern urban life often strips away such reassurance. Offices change supervisors, factories change shifts, rent rises. Street names remain while neighborhoods alter beneath them. In contrast, the hidden room promises continuity. The piano waits. The bar shines. The same nod meets you. The same table may even be free. Such things become emotional furniture. At intervals, the blue moon would return Margaret to safety in small ways. This is how draining environments keep their hold. After a night that left her overspent, overtired, or vaguely ashamed, the next night could feel gentler. The bartender might ask if she wanted something lighter. The music might be slower. Someone might pull out a chair and speak to her with such warm familiarity that the room once again seemed not demanding, but sheltering. A predatory system rarely approaches as a constant blow. It alternates pressure with comfort. It teaches the exhausted mind that the place causing depletion is also the only place where depletion can be soothed. As the months moved on, Margaret's acquaintance with certain regulars deepened. There was a man who handled liquor shipments, or said he did, and liked to speak of narrow escapes and clever routes. There was a woman married above her boredom, who treated danger like a silk accessory, useful mainly because it made everything else seem less stale. There was a piano player whose melancholy made him appear wise. Perhaps none of these people meant, at first, to harm Margaret personally. That is another complication worth noting. Harm in such places is often structural before it is intimate. People contribute to a system without fully accounting for its appetite. Still, the system itself noticed. Establishments built on secrecy and repeat custom become unusually good at identifying who is drifting from novelty into need. Margaret was young, respectable, steadily employed, and increasingly eager to remain inside the room's social weather. She had the kind of presence that could reassure newcomers and flatter older patrons. More importantly, she had access to the daylight world. Offices, files, addresses, small practical knowledge. To a room like the Blue Moon, a regular customer with a decent face and a modest professional position was not only a source of income. She was potential usefulness. No one says such things all at once. The progression is always softer than that. A favor here. A question there. Do you know whether insurance offices are being more careful these days? Has your company become stricter about records? Are there certain kinds of small businesses they look at more closely than others? Such questions can float across a table in tones so light that they seem merely conversational. And someone who has already accepted dozens of other small normalizations may not recognize the shift when it comes. The room has become home enough that its curiosity feels harmless. Its flattering confidence feels like esteem. One begins to answer before one has fully considered why one is being asked. Margaret's difficulty was not only that she had begun to rely on the Blue Moon for feeling alive. It was that the Blue Moon had begun, gently and without announcement, to enter the architecture of her self-respect. She no longer thought of herself merely as an office secretary from a careful family. In the mirror, she could also see the woman who knew where to go after dark, who was welcomed by name, who moved easily among music and whispers and expensive-looking men. If that second self depended upon the room, then protecting the room's favor became emotionally important. The hidden economy of belonging had done its work. There are many ways criminal worlds recruit, but one of the most effective is to let the recruit believe nothing criminal is occurring at all. The room need not threaten at first. It only needs to imply that certain people are trusted and others are not. that certain conversations happen among the more sophisticated patrons, that some regulars have opportunities, others do not. In this way, vanity and dependency can be arranged into a bridge. Margaret, increasingly short of money and increasingly unwilling to lose the evenings that sustained her mood, was especially vulnerable to any offer that sounded both flattering and practical. By then, her health was also changing in quieter ways. Mornings were not always kind. Sleep came unevenly, appetite thinned. Some days her hands felt faintly unsteady until late afternoon. But these discomforts were easy to misread. Chicago produced headaches in many honest ways. Poor air, poor heat, overwork, worry, too much coffee, too little rest. A young woman could attribute a great deal to nerves and still remain socially credible. Respectability, paradoxically, can hide deterioration by making others reluctant to suspect it. Family members prefer innocent explanations. Employers prefer temporary ones. The sufferer herself prefers almost any explanation that postpones the need to face a pattern. So the drift continued. At the office, Margaret became more distracted. Not incompetently so at first, but enough that the mind wandered from ledgers to lamplight tables. She found herself impatient with co-workers who now seemed not merely dull, but curiously incomplete, as if they had accepted a version of life too narrow to contain real excitement. This is another cost of hidden glamour. It does not only lure, it quietly impoverishes the charm of everything outside itself. The ordinary day begins to feel like a waiting room. The night below the flower shop claims the status of reality. The blue moon, meanwhile, could soften after each small shock. If Margaret had overdone it one evening and stumbled home full of self-disgust and nausea, the next visit might be calmer, more gracious, almost restorative. A small table in the corner, a slower song, someone asking after her with what seemed like sincere concern. She would feel again that the place understood her, that whatever discomfort had come from too much drinking or too little sleep was not the room's fault, but simply the roughness of life outside it. Thus she returned not only for stimulation, but for recovery. It is difficult to escape a place one has begun to treat as both wound and remedy. At some point, though no one could have named the date precisely, the blue moon ceased to be merely where Margaret went. It became where much of her inward life waited for her. When she imagined relief, she imagined the stairs. When she imagined confidence, she imagined a glass in hand and amber light over polished wood. When she imagined being seen, she did not picture the office or the apartment or the family home. She pictured faces turning toward her in that low room beneath the flowers. That was when the more dangerous invitations became possible. One evening, after a stretch of ordinary conversation and music, a man connected to the Blue Moon's management asked Margaret whether she might know how certain business records were stored, or how long certain files remained accessible, or whether offices like hers tended to be more relaxed near closing time. He asked as if he admired her competence. He suggested that decent people with professional habits understood useful things. He even hinted that there were firms in the city willing to pay for minor consulting of that kind, especially in confusing times when so many legal arrangements had been turned upside down by federal restrictions. Nothing about the request, in the exact form it arrived, sounded like melodramatic villainy. It sounded like recognition, like stepping into a slightly more important version of oneself. Margaret did not immediately think of theft or fraud or corruption. She thought of money she could use, of debts to herself, of evenings maintained without quite so much worry. Most of all, she thought of not falling in status within the only social world that had come to feel vivid and modern and alive. A young woman who has spent months learning how much better she feels in one room than in every other room may agree to all kinds of ambiguity before she agrees to exclusion. Around this time, Chicago itself was shifting in the broader sense. Hidden drinking rooms had become not isolated curiosities but part of an underground civic rhythm. Some were rough and opportunistic, others were polished enough to attract clerks, musicians, professionals, wealthy wives, brokers, visiting businessmen, and neighborhood girls in new shoes. The more successful establishments were no longer only places to sell liquor. They were places to assemble relationships. Information moved there alongside jazz. Introductions happened there. Trust, or what felt like trust, formed there more easily because everyone present was already participating in a shared secrecy. This is how a hidden room can become much more than a room. It becomes a membrane between legal daylight life and the interests growing beneath it. A respectable employee may step below ground only intending to drink, dance lightly, and forget her week. But if she returns often enough, if she begins to answer to a second social identity built there, if she runs short of money, if she needs the room's approval more than she needs the approval of people who sleep earlier and live more plainly, then the membrane thins. On one side stands the life she was taught to keep. On the other side waits the life that flatters her. The crossing can happen almost without sensation. Margaret crossed little by little, not in one grand decision, but in a string of evenings that each seemed manageable while they were happening. A detail mentioned here, a question answered there, a favor that felt too small to deserve the name compromise. And when her mind grew tired of measuring where the line had been, the blue moon offered her the old comforts again, the low room, the softened light, the sense that for another hour she might simply rest inside the performance of being at ease. She answered harmless questions first, then somewhat less harmless ones. She accepted small gifts she would once have refused. She told herself that everyone in such rooms knew things, traded things, arranged things. The city itself seemed to operate through favors, introductions, and unofficial understandings. Why should her own small contributions matter so much? Such thoughts are common because they are convenient. They allow a person to remain, in their own mind, fundamentally decent while moving through increasingly compromised ground. Yet even compromise can remain strangely quiet in a sleepy historical world. It does not always arrive with pistols, shouts, or slammed doors. More often it is composed of envelopes, vague language, information passed, because someone insists it is merely practical. Meetings framed as opportunities, and a tone of effortless sophistication that makes moral hesitation feel provincial. Margaret had not become hard. She had become tired in new ways, dependent in new ways, and increasingly unwilling to lose the only environment where her exhaustion seemed to dissolve on contact. If she had tried to stay away for long, she would have discovered more clearly what the room had done to her nervous system. Even now, brief absences were unpleasant. The city felt abrasive. Her own thoughts seemed to scratch. Anxiety, though she might not yet have named it as such, began appearing during ordinary afternoons, followed by an overpowering sense that evening was the only medicine worth trusting. She might have kept a small flask at this stage, or accepted one from a familiar hand, just to steady herself before the day finally released her. Many people in those years would have called that merely taking the edge off. They had no finer language for what was taking shape. Hidden rooms produce hidden epidemics partly because the early symptoms imitate other kinds of strain. A little trembling can be blamed on too little lunch. A low headache can be blamed on bookkeeping or tobacco smoke. A troubled stomach can be blamed on coffee, weather, nerves, city air. And when the person suffering is respectable, well-dressed, still mostly punctual, still able to speak sensibly and smile, the suspicion of serious decline remains dormant in everyone around them. It is easier to see wreckage than drift, but drift, if left uncorrected, often carries a person farther. Margaret was not alone in this, though she did not yet understand the pattern as a pattern. Elsewhere in the city, other hidden rooms were tuning themselves to other kinds of longing. There were establishments where young men of professional ambition were invited through private business circles, rather than by adventurous friends after work. There were rooms where liquor was poured in quieter company under the appearance of commercial discussion. There were gatherings arranged through fashion, music, or charity, where women with talent and modest wages found themselves admitted into rooms that looked less like vice than like advancement. Different staircase, same logic, different dress, same hunger. One such man might have been Thomas Brady, an accountant in a respectable legal office. the sort of man whose career looked orderly from the outside, yet never quite accelerated in the way he hoped. Chicago was full of men like him, neat in collar and cuff, educated enough to understand numbers and procedure, ambitious enough to ache privately at being overlooked. For such a man, the invitation did not need to mention jazz or hidden rebellion. It only needed to suggest influence, a private gathering, discreet investors, men who appreciated intelligence. The room would be arranged less like a basement revel and more like a club for serious conversation. But the seduction beneath remained familiar. A drink stronger than expected, attentive company, the intoxicating possibility that one's real life might begin after being properly noticed. And there might have been someone like Elena Rossetti, a gifted seamstress or designer's assistant, whose days were spent touching fabrics intended for women wealthier than she was. For her, the staircase into danger could be lined not with business talk, but with elegance. She could be invited to fittings for private events, then drawn into the orbit of those events themselves, where the rooms were larger, the gowns finer, and the alcohol presented as if it had crossed oceans rather than alleys. One need not desire criminal adventure to become vulnerable in such a world. One need only desire beauty, recognition, or enough money to believe that a different future is finally approaching. This broader truth matters because it changes the story from individual weakness to social mechanism. The hidden city below Chicago's lawful surface did not prey only on one class, or one temperament, or one level of innocence. It looked for fatigue in one person, ambition in another, aesthetic longing in a third. It learned how to dress itself according to the need in front of it. To the bored, it appeared thrilling. To the lonely, it appeared intimate. To the ambitious, it appeared connected. To the artistic, it appeared glamorous. Beneath all these costumes was the same patient talent for turning longing into habit and habit into leverage. By the time Margaret sensed more sharply that something was wrong, much of her life had already been quietly reorganized. Her work had begun to suffer in ways visible enough that supervisors grew less indulgent. Her family heard less from her. Her finances were ragged. Yet she still returned to the Blue Moon because each return temporarily repaired the damage caused by the last. That is another of the money-making miracles of dependency. It compels the sufferer to seek relief in the very environment that is teaching the body and mind to require it. There were nights, no doubt, when she felt a flash of alarm, a gap in memory, a conversation only half recalled, the sudden realization, walking home in night air, that she had agreed to something she could not clearly reconstruct. But such alarms are exhausting in themselves, and the easiest way to quiet them is often to sink again into the atmosphere that can reinterpret them. In the Blue Moon, a troubling incident could be made to feel glamorous or trivial, or simply part of city life. Outside, alone in a small room, it might feel sinister. So she returned to the place that translated discomfort into style. This was especially dangerous because the liquor itself was not what its presentation suggested. In legal saloons before Prohibition, a person might at least expect some consistency in production, some ordinary commercial incentive not to poison one's patrons openly. But the underground market obeyed different pressures. Speed mattered, volume mattered, supply routes mattered, cutting corners mattered. A clever mixer and enough citrus could disguise not only rough distillation but contamination. One need not describe every chemical detail to understand the effect. Bodies weakened, nerves frayed, sleep shattered. The line between emotional dependence and physical distress blurred until the sufferer no longer knew whether they were chasing pleasure or merely fleeing collapse. Margaret's mornings by now would have had a special sort of sadness to them. Light through cheap curtains, a mouth gone dry, clothing not fully put away. The memory of a song still floating somewhere behind the eyes, but with it, the heavier realization that daylight required a person she no longer found easy to inhabit. She had not lost the knowledge of who she ought to be. That might have been simpler in some ways. Instead, she lived between selves. The office self, dutiful and correct. The night self, warm and wanted. The frightened self, appearing in brief intervals and asking questions she could not bear for long. When a human being is divided in that way, exhaustion deepens because each self drains the others. And still, after the day had scraped across her nerves long enough, the old return to safety would reassert itself. She would imagine the staircase, the lowering of sound, the amber lamps, the first easy glass, the subtle greeting that meant her place at the table still existed. Whatever had frightened her could be softened there. Whatever shame had gathered during a sober morning could be dissolved into the room's more flattering interpretation of her life. So she went back down. The city, meanwhile, was paying a wider price, even as many citizens continued to romanticize the hidden nightlife. For every glamorous story repeated later in memory, there were quieter stories of damaged wages, blurred records, favors asked under dim light, businesses probed for weaknesses, lonely people made useful because they were eager to remain included. The criminality of such a world did not always stand center stage. Often it waited in the wings while the band played. That made it all the more effective. Few people willingly walk into what looks obviously monstrous. Many walk, step by step, into what looks stylish, forgiving, and faintly superior to ordinary life. Thomas, in his more polished room with businesslike furniture and carefully moderated conversation, may have found himself giving information he once would have considered confidential, because the men asking framed it as market intelligence. Elena, in her softer world of gowns and private parties, may have found herself asked to notice who wore what, who arrived with whom, who had means, who had weaknesses, who trusted too easily. Margaret, in the Blue Moon, may have passed along small office knowledge under the vague belief that she was merely helping savvy men navigate the absurdities of prohibition. None of them needed to think of themselves as criminals. The hidden city thrived precisely because it offered language softer than the truth. What, then, finally exposed the illusion? Not one single event for everyone. More often a slow accumulation of cost. For Margaret it may have been the growing impossibility of separating a good evening from a necessary one. Or the first time she realized she could not pass more than a handful of sober hours without trembling inwardly toward relief. Or the first meeting arranged outside the Blue Moon that felt less social and more evaluative, as if her continued place in that world now depended on usefulness rather than charm. Perhaps there was a night when the room felt wrong in a way she could not dismiss. More crowded than usual, too many men who watched rather than drank, a sharper smell beneath the perfume and tobacco, an edge under the music. Barely audible but there, the hidden city always changed eventually, because pressure from outside never ceased. Raids were threatened, routes shifted, owners hedged their risks, suppliers cut quality, management extracted more from patrons when they sensed instability. In unstable systems, those nearest dependency suffer first, because they have the least power to withdraw. If a man running a room believed authorities were coming, he might close for a week and leave town. A customer like Margaret could not simply close herself and leave. Her need traveled with her. Her debt, emotional and financial, traveled with her. Her compromised decisions traveled with her, so the room became both more dangerous and more necessary at once. There would have been evenings when the Blue Moon almost overreached, and then compensated by becoming especially soothing the next time. A patron frightened by too much drink might be treated with extra tenderness on return. Someone worried about money might be quietly extended credit, or given a better seat, or made to feel favored in ways that cost the establishment little and returned much. Such gestures are not kindness in the deepest sense, though they may feel kind to the recipient. They are investments in continuity, and continuity is the raw material from which dependency is built. By now, Margaret had drifted so far from her earlier equilibrium that whole regions of ordinary life felt inaccessible. Family conversation exhausted her. Quiet evenings made her skin seem too tight. Work without the promise of later escape felt almost impossible. She may have told herself many versions of the same lie, that once things were calmer, once money was better, once she had 1 or 2 weeks of proper rest, once this stressful patch had passed, she would naturally step back from the Blue Moon. People often imagine recovery as a future act of will conveniently timed after current pleasure is finished. But by the time a hidden room has become a governing climate inside the mind, stepping away requires not future ease but present rupture. And rupture was what she could not face, so the room continued to do what it did best. It offered borrowed warmth. It disguised appetite as welcome. It let the city's tired and ambitious descend into a world that seemed, at every surface level, to understand them better than the lawful world did. Some would say later that the speakeasy sold rebellion. In many cases it sold something subtler and more profitable than rebellion. It sold relief from being ordinary, even if only until last call. It sold community without accountability. It sold a curated version of danger, in which a person could feel daring, while also feeling held. Such combinations are rare and potent. They linger in cultural memory because they touch something deep. They also destroy more quietly than the memory suggests. If we pause here and look not only at Margaret but across the city, the pattern becomes even clearer. In office towers and dress shops and legal firms and hotels, there were people finishing long days under the weight of modern urban life. They did not all wish for excess. Many wished only for softness, for somewhere the nerves could rest without feeling deadened, for a room where a person could be welcomed before they were judged. Hidden nightlife in Chicago learned to present itself as precisely that softness. The fact that it also fed rackets, corruption, extortion, and toxic commerce did not diminish the softness on the surface. It made the surface more important. That is why the middle of these stories is always quieter than people expect. Not a crash, but a lull. Not a gunshot, but the repeated lowering of a body into the same chair at the same table, under the same lamp. Not a villain's speech, but the familiar bartender setting down a glass before the hand even asks. In this middle stretch lies the real sleep content of history, because history is often not a sequence of explosions. It is a sequence of repeated comforts becoming expensive in ways no one notices soon enough. A city hums above. A piano keeps its patient line below. A person returns, sits, exhales, and lets the room explain the world again, in softer terms. One evening Margaret might have caught her own reflection in a mirror behind the bar, and failed, just for a second, to reconcile it with the version of herself she once carried to church or to work in the clear morning. Not because she looked wicked, but because she looked arranged, painted into a role, kept in circulation by forces she only partly understood. That flicker of self-recognition may have frightened her more than any threat could have done. Yet, almost at once, someone would speak to her kindly. The band would turn into a slower number. A glass would touch the table, and the room would gather her back into its softer interpretation. The alarm would pass, the drift would continue. Thomas, elsewhere, might have experienced a similar flicker while handing over a piece of information that no longer felt quite innocent. Elena might have felt it while adjusting a gown for a woman whose jewels suggested one world, while the room's secrecy suggested another. Such flickers, spread across a city, rarely added up to immediate resistance. They added up instead to a deepening atmosphere of moral fog. People do not always need to believe they are good. Often, they need only to believe that everyone is compromised in small ways, and that theirs is no worse than anyone else's. Hidden systems survive on that modest, foggy threshold. And then there was the body. Always, eventually, the body. The laughter in such rooms, however lovely in the moment, often had a cost the next day. The bright confidence bought on one floor of the city borrowed heavily from the organs and nerves waiting upstairs. Harsh spirits disguised as refinement worked their patient damage. Sleep shortened, palms dampened, thoughts raced at the wrong hours and dulled at others. Food lost its claim, faces thinned, hands shook. In another era, with another vocabulary, people might have named these things with clearer precision. In that era they became part of a murky category of nerves: overwork, city strain, feminine weakness, masculine pressure, digestive upset, or simple bad luck. How convenient such vagueness was for everyone profiting. Margaret's family, if they noticed, would have noticed around the edges first. She seemed tired, too busy, less steady in her promises, more careful in avoiding detail. Perhaps her mother worried over weight loss. Perhaps a sibling observed that she no longer came around without glancing at the clock. Perhaps Margaret herself, seeing her face by morning light, felt a private grief she translated into irritation. None of this automatically stops a descent. In some cases, it deepens it. Because criticism, even loving criticism, sends the sufferer more eagerly back toward the one place where she still feels admired. That is another reason return to safety must be mentioned again and again in stories like this. Wow. The hidden room was not only an engine of depletion. It was also staged as refuge after every emotionally expensive scene in Margaret's life. The blue moon could reinterpret the scene in a manner that drew her closer. Family concern became suffocating provincialism. Workplace scrutiny became evidence that office life was soulless. Her own guilt became proof that she cared too much, felt too deeply, was too sensitive for ordinary modern existence. Such interpretations are seductive because they transform consequences into romantic character. A person stops asking whether the room is bad for them and starts believing the room is the only place that understands why they suffer. If the story ended there, it would already be sad enough. But hidden systems built on appetite tend to widen their claims over time. Once a customer's emotional dependence is sufficiently established, usefulness becomes attractive. One can ask for a little more: information, presence at a meeting, delivery of a message, a discreet inquiry in an office. The person asked often complies not because they are hardened, but because the request arrives wrapped in trust, urgency, and style. It sounds adult. It sounds worldly. It sounds like being chosen. Margaret, by then, had become exactly the sort of person a hidden room values most. Not powerful enough to protect herself, not poor enough to be dismissed, respectable enough to cross thresholds, dependent enough not to walk away easily. She could still look like a decent citizen in daylight. That made her extremely useful in a city where illegal networks increasingly preferred the appearance of legitimacy to the old theatrics of open brutality. The wider criminal landscape of Chicago was learning the same lesson. Organizations that had once been satisfied merely to move alcohol had discovered the richer possibilities of information, influence, and social disguise. A hidden drinking room could be a shop, yes, but also an antechamber. Business was conducted there in smiles and fragments. Reputations were assessed there. Vulnerable people were noticed there. The jazz, the flowers, the honey in the cocktails, the polished wood, the careful dress, all of it formed not only ambiance, but camouflage. The more refined the camouflage, the longer it could survive. And the more elegant the room appeared, the easier it became for a tired mind to believe it had entered, not danger, but refuge. Yet camouflage cannot hold forever against accumulated cost. Somewhere in the city, customers began falling ill in ways too severe to ignore. Somewhere, families pawned valuables to cover debts or treatment. Somewhere, records went missing, claims were manipulated, favors compounded into schemes. Somewhere, officials watching the hidden economy began to see that underground rooms were not merely social novelties, but infrastructural nodes in a larger web. Even then, however, exposure was uneven. The hidden city could lose one room and open another, close one staircase, and find a side entrance elsewhere. Its greatest resilience lay in the fact that the longings it sold to were ordinary and renewable. Fatigue returns each day, loneliness returns, ambition returns. The market for emotional relief never closes for long. Margaret had by now traveled so far within the blue moon's weather that a clean return to ordinary life may have seemed almost unimaginable. The habits that once steadied her had thinned. The moral vocabulary with which she might have judged herself had grown exhausted from overuse. She was not constantly panicked. That would have been easier to recognize. She was instead unwell in a diluted, ongoing fashion, frequently soothed, periodically alarmed, and almost always inclined toward the next descent below the flower shop. That is what makes such stories historically haunting. The victim is not seized in one violent act. She is taught patiently, to collaborate with what consumes her. If we look again at Thomas and Elena, the same truth appears in different costumes. Thomas is taught to imagine compromise as professional sophistication. Elena is taught to imagine it as elegant participation in a world usually reserved for others. Margaret is taught to imagine it as intimate belonging and urban modernity. 3 roads, all lined with some version of borrowed light. 3 people, all convinced at crucial moments that they are not stepping downward so much as upward into life as it is really lived. That inversion may be the most profitable invention of the era. And still the room could soothe, even late in the process. Margaret might sit with a lighter drink and listen to the piano on a slow night and feel, with a sincerity that cannot be dismissed, that there was something beautiful in what she had found. This is important, because historical honesty requires us to admit that destructive worlds are often not devoid of beauty. Their beauty is part of how they sustain themselves. The danger is not that the music was false in every note, or that the lamplight was somehow unreal. The danger is that genuine sensory beauty was harnessed to a system indifferent to the bodies and futures of those who came to rely on it. Beauty without care becomes expensive. Intimacy without accountability becomes exploitative. Relief sold repeatedly at a premium becomes a form of extraction. The Blue Moon, like many rooms of its kind, had learned all 3 lessons well. As winter turned and the city moved through another season of commerce and rumor, Margaret's inner world narrowed. Things not connected to the hidden room lost color. The future, once perhaps made of marriage or advancement, or at least modest steadiness, became difficult to picture. She was not incapable of imagining another life. She was simply incapable of feeling its warmth. That is one of the quiet tragedies of dependence. It robs alternatives not only of practicality, but of emotional temperature. The harmful thing glows, the healthier thing remains cold and abstract. In this state, people can continue astonishingly long, especially when the surrounding culture still romanticizes the very structure harming them. Chicago loved to tell stories about its own daring. Newspapers whispered. Movies later polished memory into a sheen of rebellion and sparkle. But glitter in hindsight often conceals fatigue in the moment. A city may romanticize the very staircase down which thousands quietly misplaced themselves. There may have come a night when the blue moon felt fuller than usual, the laughter sharper, the pores heavier, the men around the edges too intent. Such nights happen in unstable enterprises when profit is pressed urgently against risk. Owners double down, staff smooth over irregularities, patrons, already softened by habit, notice just enough to feel uneasy, and then drink past the feeling. Margaret, if present on such a night, would not have required a dramatic scene to understand that the room had changed. A shift in tone is often enough. The air itself seems to watch, but even then, another return to safety was available. Someone draws close, someone says not to worry, the next song is slow, the next drink is called something gentle, the room assures you once more that all is well, and that what troubles you comes from outside, from the cold street, from the law, from anxious families, from people who have never understood. Thus the room preserves itself by preserving your wish to believe in it. When the bill for such belief eventually arrives, it rarely comes as a single moral sentence. It arrives as health gone thin, opportunities spoiled, trust frayed, and a nervous system that no longer knows how to settle except through the path that is damaging it. It arrives in families forced to carry confusion and embarrassment. It arrives in workplaces where once promising employees begin to blur at the edges. It arrives in records bent for the convenience of hidden interests, in businesses nudged toward loss, in legal daylight life quietly contaminated by favors exchanged under amber lamps. This is what the polished legend of the speakeasy often leaves out. Not because the legend lies in every detail, but because it edits for charm. It remembers the dress and not the debt, the music and not the shaking hands the next morning, the thrill of secrecy and not the dependence secrecy can breed, the rebellious sparkle and not the way criminal systems learn to wrap themselves in sparkle precisely because sparkle lowers suspicion. Margaret, in the end, would not have needed to die spectacularly for the damage to be real. It would be enough that the hidden room had consumed the structure of her days, narrowed the range of her self-respect, and taught her body to seek comfort where exploitation lived. Thomas would not need a sensational courtroom fate for his life to have been misshaped. Elena would not need a melodramatic confession for her talent to have been diverted into a network that valued her only as long as she remained useful. The city's underground appetite was measured as much in worn-out futures as in raids and headlines. And yet, even as we draw nearer to the end of this long descent, it is worth pausing one more time above the moralizing impulse. People like Margaret were not foolish in some simple sense. They were human in a recognizably modern sense. They were tired. They wanted company. They wanted beauty. They wanted to feel briefly more alive than their pay envelopes allowed. They wanted an evening that did not flatten into duty before it began. Hidden Chicago understood this. That is why it prospered. It did not first sell wrongdoing. It sold reprieve. Perhaps that is why the memory of these rooms still lingers so softly in the mind of history. The flower shop at street level remains such a perfect image. Petals above, appetite below. Ordinary commerce protecting extraordinary need. The staircase itself feels almost literary, as if one descends not merely into a basement but into a mood. Culture loves such moods. It is less eager to remember the invoices, the compromised files, the spoiled organs, the anxious mothers, the clerks, who could no longer distinguish a refuge from a trap. If you stood now on such a Chicago corner in imagination, after midnight, and looked into the flower shop window, you would see only flowers again. That is another tenderness history offers. It lets surfaces close over what once moved beneath them. The shop sleeps. The streetcar passes. A man hurries home with his collar up. Somewhere overhead a window shade falls. Nothing advertises the rooms that once taught so many people to confuse warmth with safety. And yet, the lesson remains. What the Speakeasy sold most successfully was not liquor. Liquor was only the liquid form of the promise. The deeper commodity was transformation. For a few hours you could become less lonely, less ordinary, less observed in all the wrong ways, and more observed in the right ones. You could belong without explaining yourself. You could feel chosen in a city that usually treated you as part of the crowd. That is a powerful bargain, and like many powerful bargains, it becomes dangerous precisely where it feels most merciful. So when we think of old Chicago at night, it may be gentler, and perhaps more honest, to picture not only gangsters and agents and raids, but also clerks with tired shoulders, seamstresses who wanted beauty, accountants who wanted advancement, daughters who wanted one warm room in which they did not feel invisible. Picture them pausing at a flower shop door. Picture the low light beneath. Picture the first descent that felt like relief, and then picture how easily relief can become routine. How routine can become need, and how need can quietly rearrange a life before the life fully understands what is happening. Still, I would not close the door too hard on the image. History for sleep is kinder when it leaves a little air around its endings. Let the blue moon remain, for one last moment, what it seemed to be from the staircase. A place of music, warmth, and temporary escape. Let the piano play softly from the corner. Let the glass catch amber light. Let the city above feel very far away. Then let the scene widen. Just enough, until the warmth becomes more complicated, and the room reveals itself, as many rooms did in that era. Half refuge, half machine. By then the listener knows enough. The hidden room below the flowers was never only one thing. It was comfort and commerce, atmosphere and appetite, beauty and indifference. It offered release to weary people while slowly teaching some of them to depend upon the conditions of that release. It dressed criminal opportunism in civilized textures. It turned secrecy into intimacy and intimacy into leverage. And it did all this so gently, so stylishly, that generations afterward would remember the glow more readily than the cost. Perhaps that is always the danger with elegant forms of harm. They rarely look like harm while the lamps are lit. So the street grows quiet again. The flower shop darkens, somewhere far below. The last note from the piano seems to linger longer than it should. then dissolve into the grain of old wood and sleeping brick. The stairs are still there in the mind, though no one is descending them now. The room has emptied into memory. The glasses are still. The smoke thins. Chicago keeps its secrets the way old cities do. Under ordinary doors, beneath modest businesses, behind stories polished smoother by time. And you can leave it there if you like, not sealed shut. Not fully resolved, just resting. A hidden door, a tired city, a room that understood too well what weary people longed to feel. And somewhere, in that long vanished night, a young woman who only wanted relief sat beneath a low lamp, listened to the music, lifted her glass, and believed for a little while that she had found a safer version of herself. That belief, more than the drink, was the true intoxication. And like the last warm light in a basement room after midnight, it fades slowly. If we were to linger a little longer in that lost Chicago, and not rush too quickly toward conclusion, we might notice how many such rooms depended upon the city's double nature. By day, Chicago was invoices, trains, deliveries, meatpacking smoke, legal offices, typed correspondence, dry goods, apartments heated unevenly, mothers reading bills, and young workers polishing their shoes for jobs that only barely noticed them. By night, the same city could appear to loosen at the collar. Offices emptied, but the energy they had compressed all day did not disappear. It moved elsewhere. It drifted into jazz cellars, hotel suites, back rooms, rooftops, private clubs, and basement bars hidden under harmless businesses. The city had learned to split itself, and many of its people learned to split with it. That split could feel strangely modern. A person who lived honestly by daylight and then vanished into secrecy after dark might tell themselves they had discovered balance rather than fracture. The lawful self earned the wage. The hidden self tasted life, as long as both selves could still be carried by one body. The arrangement might even seem sustainable. But history is full of arrangements that feel sustainable right up until the point they begin to consume what is carrying them. Hidden nightlife was one of those arrangements. It asked not only for money, but for nervous energy, for emotional allegiance, for the slow reshaping of desire. Margaret would not have spoken in such abstract terms. She would have known only that the day and the night had ceased to feel equal. The office gave her a living. The blue moon gave her feeling. When those two things separate inside a person, trouble rarely remains far away. Human beings can survive on duty for long stretches, but they do not thrive there. So when an environment appears that supplies color, tempo, and welcome all at once, the mind begins to protect it with unusual devotion. This is not stupidity. It is a deeply ordinary vulnerability. It is part of why so much exploitation throughout history has been arranged not around obvious cruelty, but around the organized sale of relief. There were, too, the small sensory cues that made return so easy. The smell of orange peel twisted over a glass, the soft rasp of a match, the shine of the piano under lamp glow, the coolness of a stair rail beneath the hand, the little pause before a password was accepted, the curtain or second door or turn in the corridor that made entry feel like crossing a threshold into secrecy, earned rather than given. Sensory memory can pull more strongly than argument. One does not defeat such places merely by knowing they are dangerous. One misses them with the skin. That is why even people who later saw the damage clearly could continue to romanticize the atmosphere long after the atmosphere had harmed them. A room may poison you and still be beautiful. A season of your life may derail you and still shimmer in recollection, because what glowed there was not entirely false. The laughter existed, the music existed, the dress really did catch the light, the relief was real in the moment. It is only that the system built around these real sensations was extractive, and the extraction continued after the sensation had passed. Thomas, for example, might have found his own hidden room quieter than Margaret's, but no less seductive in structure. He would not descend beneath a flower shop with a bold friend at his side. He might instead be invited by a client, a colleague, or a man whose shoes and cufflinks suggested stability. The room might stand above a supposedly respectable import office, or behind a private dining space, where the talk was of freight, municipal shifts, legal adjustments, and opportunity. A man like Thomas, who had spent years being merely competent in the eyes of superiors, could find himself suddenly treated as insightful. He could be offered better whiskey than he had ever tasted before. He could be asked what he thought rather than told what to do. Such things intoxicate before the liquor is halfway gone. And because his form of longing was different, the hidden system would shape itself accordingly. He would be flattered through seriousness rather than spectacle. The conversation would imply that he belonged among men dealing in large concerns. The information he was asked for would appear practical, commercial, sophisticated. A figure here, a timetable there, a legal preference, a filing habit, a sense of which office moved more slowly on Fridays. Nothing in isolation necessarily felt criminal enough to cause a rupture in self-image. That was the brilliance of the arrangement. If every step feels plausibly professional, then the stairs into compromise become almost invisible. Elena's path, by contrast, might have been lit with fabric and aspiration. A woman who spent her days sewing for women wealthier than herself could be made vulnerable through proximity to elegance. She did not need to crave drunkenness or even social notoriety. She needed only to glimpse a world of private parties and polished confidence and believe, for a while, that her talent had finally opened the right door. At such gatherings, the liquor might be poured more delicately, the music softer, the conversation more curated. Yet, the same mechanism would pulse beneath the silk. She would be seen, praised, paid unusually well for small tasks. Trusted with details, then trusted with more. The slope remained gradual, because gradualness protects the illusion of choice. What unites these different lives is not melodrama but texture. History often becomes truer when we attend to texture instead of merely event. The texture here is one of repetition, velveted over with mood. Men and women entering rooms after long workdays, faces relaxing in low light. The city's harsh angles softening after the second drink. A habit forming not because each night was extraordinary, but because each night offered some calibrated correction to the day. A little warmth against cold routine, a little significance against anonymity, a little beauty against fatigue. Measured that way, the Speakeasy was not simply a business or an illegal bar. It was an emotional service industry, and one with a very profitable understanding of customer retention. It knew, for instance, that people return more reliably to places that remember them. A bartender who recalls your usual order is not just demonstrating hospitality. He is quietly confirming that your existence has shape there. A hostess who seats you near familiar faces gives you continuity. A pianist who nods as you arrive turns attendance into participation. These things seem gentle because they are gentle. They are also strategic. The human nervous system settles in remembered spaces. When the modern city has left you overstimulated, fragmented, and unseen, remembered space feels like healing even when it is attached to harm. Margaret's steady descent, then, was sustained not by constant excess, but by the alternation of stimulation and reassurance. One night she might drink too much and feel half sick with self-reproach the next afternoon. Another night she would return and be folded so softly back into the room's warmth that the previous discomfort seemed like a misunderstanding. That alternation matters. People cannot tolerate uninterrupted depletion for very long. But if depletion is repeatedly followed by stylized comfort, the comfort gains extraordinary power. Soon the mind begins to focus not on the harm, but on the relief that follows it. Then the whole cycle becomes self-perpetuating. One can almost imagine the weekly rhythm: Monday with a faint ache and sour nerves, Tuesday dominated by memory and anticipation, Wednesday perhaps spent resisting the thought of going, which only intensified the thought, Thursday holding some private promise, Friday shining with inevitability, Saturday carrying either indulgence or recovery disguised as indulgence, Sunday colored by avoidance, of family, of church, of sober rooms full of plain questions. Then Monday again, but thinner now, Because the night world has taught the body what daylight cannot supply. When a life settles into that rhythm, the person inside it often stops making large decisions, and instead begins making 100 tiny accommodations. A little less sleep, a little more debt, a few omitted details in conversation, a small lie about where the money went, a postponed visit, an unreturned call, a file glanced at longer than necessary, a name remembered for the wrong person. Such accommodations do not announce themselves as ruin. They present as adjustments, yet it is through accumulated adjustment that entire biographies bend. And the city made it easier to hide. Chicago was too large, too busy, too full of motion for every private decline to become public. Boarding houses offered thin intimacy. Offices valued output more than understanding. Families were often too far, too overworked, or too eager to believe the best until the worst had already matured. Even physicians, when consulted, had limited language for forms of dependency tied not only to alcohol, but to atmosphere, shame, and hidden social identity. A person like Margaret could be visibly thinning, inwardly panicked, intermittently useful to dubious men, and still remain legible to the world as simply overtired. If we imagine one of her evenings in deeper detail, perhaps she leaves work in the early dark with the headache already beginning behind the eyes. The office has been dry and overbright. A supervisor has been curt. Money is tight. She tells herself she ought to go home. But the thought of home is colorless. The thought of the blue moon has color. The difference decides the matter before she admits it. On the walk there, her steps quicken almost without instruction. The flower shop bell sounds, the private glance, the hidden door. Then the descent, and with it the first inward exhale of the day. Such moments teach the body loyalty. Once seated, she may not even drink immediately. Sometimes the room itself is enough at first, a chair that feels familiar, a tune already in progress, a known face lifting a hand. Perhaps she smiles before she truly feels like smiling. But in hidden places, performance often becomes emotion by passing through the body often enough. She takes the glass when it arrives. The first sip smooths her. The second deepens the separation from the office day. By the third, whatever moral unease she carried in with her has softened into atmosphere. This is not nothing. It is a reliable neurological event, repeated often enough to become cherished. And once cherished, it becomes difficult to oppose with reason alone. All the while, subtle observation continues around her. Who is drinking harder than usual? Who is short of cash? Who is lonely enough to stay after friends depart? Who has access to which office? Which warehouse? Which records? Which family? Which rumor? Hidden rooms listen because listening is profitable. Sometimes they use what they hear crudely. More often they wait until the information can be woven into a flattering request. Could you help with something? Would you mind checking a detail? You're the only one we trust with that sort of thing. Such phrases turn surveillance into intimacy. That is what makes these rooms historically more unsettling than the popular image suggests. Their real intelligence was social. They did not simply pour liquor into a city that wanted drink. They studied the emotional topography of modern urban life and found where to place their stares. They placed them under beauty, under professionalism, under music, under confidence, under the fantasy of being chosen. Then they waited for people like Margaret to descend. Even at the level of decor, the lesson is telling. Why the flowers above ground? Why the polished bar below? Why the soft light rather than something harsher? Because human beings enter moral fog more readily when the fog is scented, flattering, and dim. The senses can be enlisted in the service of ambiguity. A room that smelled of rot and looked mean would have driven away many of the very patrons most valuable to the underground economy. A room that looked civilized, by contrast, could persuade those patrons that their own participation was civilized too. None of this means every conversation was sinister or every patron ruined. History is rarely that tidy. Many people surely pass through such rooms without collapsing into dependence or being drawn into hidden schemes. That too is part of the picture. The danger of a predatory environment lies partly in how normal and survivable it remains for some. Their easy passage helps preserve the myth that the room is harmless, even while more vulnerable regulars are being changed by it in slower, quieter ways. Systems of harm often protect themselves through uneven distribution of consequence. Margaret, though, was not one of the lucky passers-through. The room found in her exactly the combination that made repetition powerful: fatigue, emotional hunger, a respectable outer life, enough imagination to be enchanted, and enough loneliness to mistake recognition for care. Over time, the enchantment ceased to feel optional. It became woven into the very idea of what counted as relief. By then, even if the blue moon occasionally frightened her, the fear did not carry her away from the room. It drove her more deeply into its softer corners. One can imagine the softer corners: a booth shielded from the central floor, a slower set from the pianist late in the evening, a glass of water placed beside the drink as if in concern, a companion lowering their voice and speaking not of schemes or office details, but of how hard the city can be, how exhausting, how impossible to endure without somewhere to lay one's spirit down for a while. Such conversations need not be insincere to be useful. In exploitative worlds, sincerity and usefulness often coexist. That coexistence is part of why victims struggle later to interpret what happened. Was there warmth there? Yes. Was there manipulation there? Also yes. The two truths do not cancel one another. They intensify one another. As for Thomas and Elena, their rooms too would have had soothing corners. Thomas might have been reassured by the quiet civility of men who seemed to respect his mind. Elena might have been steadied by the rustle of silk, the compliment on her work, the sensation of being admitted to circles she had once only dressed from the outside. Different forms of return to safety, but the same principle. After every subtle violation of conscience, the environment offered a fresh blanket of approval. When we ask why so many such people did not simply stop, the answer is not a single flaw, but a collection of pressures arranged into climate. They did not stop because stopping would have meant surrendering the one room where they felt transformed. They did not stop because their bodies had begun to rely on what those nights provided chemically and emotionally. They did not stop because the hidden city was stitched into the larger city more deeply than any one person could see. And they did not stop because each return promised that this time would be gentler, lighter, more controlled, more like the first enchanted descent, and less like the uneasy nights in between. That hope is perhaps the saddest part. The hope that one can keep the glow and discard the cost. The hope that the beautiful room will remain only beautiful if approached with the right restraint. The hope that because one once found relief there, relief must still be the room's true nature. Hope like that can keep a person descending the same stairs long after their better judgment has moved out of the way. Eventually, as with so many hidden chapters of history, the rooms themselves sink and the stories rise. Later generations inherit the stories without inheriting the nerves, the debts, the headaches, the stale smell in the morning coat, the appointments missed, the family worry, the low panic of not knowing whether one could make it through the afternoon without whatever evening provided. Story removes drag, memory removes repetition. The resulting image gleams: a jazz room, a secret password, a clever drink, a little law-breaking in stylish shoes. We keep the film of it. We misplace the fatigue. So perhaps the gentlest correction is not to deny the glow, but to place beside it the quieter truths. Beside the glittering glass, the hand that trembled later. Beside the elegant invitation, the compromise that followed. Beside the smile at the door, the careful weighing of usefulness. Beside the romance of hidden Chicago, the very modern sorrow of people who needed comfort badly enough to buy it from systems that did not care what was left of them afterward. And even that sorrow can be spoken softly, like the last notes of a piano heard from the stairs, receding rather than striking. And still, even with all that known, one can understand the appeal. That too is important. To understand is not to excuse. It is to remain historically awake to the ordinary human needs that shape extraordinary eras. The people who descended those stairs were not monsters visiting their natural habitat. Many were simply tired citizens of a fast city, hoping to borrow warmth from the dark. That hope was beautiful. The commerce built around it was less so. By the last hour of the last night in imagination, then, we may picture the blue moon nearly empty, chairs askew, a pianist gathering his music, the bar wiped down in long strokes, Margaret lingering a little past wisdom, not because she no longer knows she should go, but because leaving means re-entering the colder version of herself waiting outside. She holds the final warmth as long as she can. The room around her seems kind again. It always could, at the end. That was one of its greatest talents. Then the climb back up, the hidden door, the flower shop, dark except for a small light. The street carrying night air like a different truth. And above all, the old city still moving, indifferent and immense, while under its ordinary surfaces so many private descents went on. That is the image worth carrying into sleep, not a slammed ending, but a layered one. Flowers above, music below, a city full of doors, and people, very human people, moving toward whatever room promised that for a few hours they would not feel so alone inside themselves.